infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, earlier this month, the pioneer in epidemic risk modeling, Metabiota, unveiled its predictions for the industries that are most likely to be impacted by a health crisis in the year ahead. So joining me to discuss these 2019 predictions is Dr. Patrick Ayscue. Dr. Ayscue is the Director of Epidemiology at Metabiota. Dr. Ayscue, welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You bet. Well, I looked at your predictions, your report, and I would say that most people, when they think of epidemics, don't really put two and two together and think of the risk to industry itself. But it is really quite a big issue. Dr. Ayscue, can you give a general overview of the epidemic risk to companies and how Metabiota determines these risks?
Yeah, certainly. So I like to draw an analogy to a lot of the natural disasters that people are probably a bit more familiar with in that space. Things like hurricanes, flooding, earthquakes. Particularly in the insurance space, there's much more familiarity with those risks. Obviously, those can shut down industries, shut down manufacturing plants, and epidemics can work quite analogously in some ways. Obviously, they're not impacting buildings, but certainly impacting the people who staff those. So a lot of what we see in impacts to industry is colored through that lens of how it's impacting the humans. So certainly in the context of epidemics, we can think of the apocalyptic scenario where there are tons of cases and tons of deaths, and obviously things are going off the wheels a little bit. We also appreciate that there's a human behavior element in response to a lot of these as well. So even in the context of relatively small outbreaks, as we would think of them in the scientific community, the perception of risk can amplify people's response to that quite expansively as well. We can see things like disruptions to supply chains, people not showing up to work, not engaging in the economy, and that can have implications across a ton of sectors.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive into the specific predictions and how you came to these conclusions. And the first industry you mentioned is travel and tourism. Kind of self-explanatory, but the floor is yours.
Yeah, that sounds great. So a lot of the work we do at Metabiota is to look at how diseases are going to move around in the world. So if we see something new, where would it go? What would it be doing? Who would it be impacting? A lot of what we appreciate with that risk perception as well is that humans will change their behavior in response to what's going on too. We've seen pretty concrete examples of that in the travel and tourism industry. The recent estimates that I saw are around $18 billion expected loss for just people changing their travel to the Caribbean and affected regions from Zika. Excuse me. We saw things similar with MERS in South Korea as well. That was an outbreak in 2015 where I believe there were about 180 cases total in the end, orders of magnitude lower than what we would expect for seasonal influenza there in any given year. But the Ministry of Finance was having to infuse $10 billion to stabilize the economy because people weren't going out and taking on some of that discretionary travel that they would otherwise. Tourism dropped by 40%. People weren't going to the movies, so you can imagine that has implications across those industries as well. So really what we're perceiving is for large-scale events, you would expect impacts from the cases and deaths mounting. For some events, that you can see those downstream implications even for smaller elements as well if people are perceiving that there's a substantial risk there. They won't be engaging in the same way, and they'll be changing their behaviors too.
Yeah. The second prediction is, I think, a little less obvious, and that's the sports industry. You're saying that a health crisis in 2019 could affect the sports industry. Can you explain that?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that again is something where I think of it in the context, particularly with the risk perception. There's really risk sitting anywhere where people are sensitive to aggregating in groups or discretionary or entertainment-based expenses as well. Within the sports industry, we had a close call with Zika and the Olympics a couple years ago. Unfortunately, they didn't end up having to move that in the end, but certainly a few weeks prior to that event taking place, that was an option on the table. Certainly the MLB, Major League Baseball, has had some experience with that as well, both moving games out of affected regions from Zika, as well as with SARS in Toronto back in, 2003 or so. The Blue Jays had to offer essentially almost free tickets to people to ensure that there were butts in the seats when they were airing it on TV. So it certainly could anticipate some impacts to the sports industry as well.
So I would take it your third prediction, the entertainment industry, is very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's with the MERS example in South Korea as well. That was one where attendance to movies dropped off by almost 50% along with that drop in tourism. So it's not just that Chinese tourists weren't visiting South Korea or canceling their trips. That obviously has implications for hotels and airlines, but domestic leisure activities as well can be heavily implicated. So that's something that we're interested in understanding better too. Obviously, tourism and travel can have long distance implications for how people are manifesting their risk perception and behavior. You can also see local effects as well. So looking at ways to incorporate that into our broader understanding of the human response to these events and how that can affect how they roll out and the downstream implications to industry as well.
So, Dr. Ayscue, how can these industries protect themselves from these dire predictions that you're making?
Yeah, I think this may seem obvious as well, but I think one of the best steps is to understand the risk that they're dealing with. In my experience, a lot of times people are very reactionary in this space. I'm sure many of your listeners can appreciate that in being familiar with it. But the problems that are in front of them are the ones that they're most equipped to deal with. So understanding that this risk does exist, just because SARS was 15 plus years ago now doesn't mean that it's not something we could see again in the near future. And having a plan in place to mitigate that once it does appear. That can take a lot of different forms, certainly, that can engage with occupational health, having emergency planning. If people are sick at work, what's the direction? If you want people to be able to work remotely, if you're losing a primary supplier, all of those things can be thought out. One of the areas we're engaging as well is helping some of our insurance partners bring products to market that can help build resilience into industries as well by essentially covering some of those losses when they do occur. If operations are disrupted or customers aren't able to make use of your goods or services, being able to cover some of those losses can help build resilience into that community level system more broadly as well. We want people to still be able to go to work. We want people to be able to continue on with their lives in the context of outbreaks, and certainly that will help build some resilience into the system as well.
Very good. Well, Dr. Ayscue, let's go ahead and close with some of my audience may not be familiar with Metabiota, and can you give us an overview of the company and the kind of work that you do, because it's kind of unique.
Yeah, certainly. I'm an epidemiologist and veterinarian by training, and came out of CDC and hopped over to Metabiota, and really been fascinated with some of the niche that we fulfill in the world in this space. We work with a lot of people on the government side, both with the United States government and international partners as well, doing things like biosafety and biosecurity training, and deploying biosurveillance programs as well. And we also do a lot of risk analytics, and that's more of what we've touched on here today, but understanding how these diseases move in the world, who we can expect to be impacted, and to your point, what people can do about them, how they can manage those effectively. So it's an interesting space, and one that certainly seems to be getting a bit more prominent. If anything, we expect these issues to be exacerbated in the near future with the extent of globalization, amongst other issues. So certainly would expect it to be a growing concern moving forward as well.
Yeah, and for the audience, if you're interested in seeing what Metabiota does, I'll put a link to their company webpage when I publish the audio to the show. So look for that there. And I want to thank you, Dr. Patrick Ayscue, for sharing these insights with us today. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much.
You bet. Take